The sterile click of the pen was the only sound Charles Whitmore wanted to hear. Terminally ill and convinced he was hopelessly in love, he was signing away a billion-dollar empire built on sweat and steel. He was leaving it all to Cassandra, his vibrant, understanding soulmate, not to Grace, the wife who now felt like a stranger, the woman who carried his unborn child in a silent, growing rebuke of their fractured marriage. He imagined Grace's devastation a small, cruel comfort in his final months. He was bequeathing a legacy of true love, he told himself. But as the final flourish of his signature dried on the heavy parchment, the penthouse door swung open, and the legacy he was about to face was one of cold, hard, inescapable truth. Charles Whitmore lived his life at an altitude of 80 floors above Manhattan, a height that offered him a god's-eye view of the world, but insulated him from its messy realities. His penthouse, a monument of glass chrome and minimalist art, felt less like a home and more like the corporate headquarters of his life. Everything was polished, perfect, and cold to the touch, just like he'd recently decided his marriage. 6 months ago, a man in a starched white coat had given him a death sentence with the clinical name glioblastoma, an aggressive, relentless tumor that was methodically unplugging the circuits of his brilliant mind. The diagnosis hadn't brought him terror, not at first. It brought a strange, clarifying fury. A fury at the wasted years, the polite dinners, the passionless obligations. A fury most of all directed at his wife, Grace. Grace Rhodes Whitmore. When he met her, she was a whirlwind of paint-splattered jeans and fiery opinions on post-war European art. She was the daughter of a quiet genius, an engineering professor named Gregory Rhodes, who saw in Charles the ambition and killer instinct he himself lacked. Grace had a grounding quality, an earthiness that anchored his soaring ambition. He had mistaken that anchor for a foundation. Now he saw it as a weight. In his mind, their marriage had become a silent contract of convenience. She curated their life, their home, their social standing, while he built Whitmore Innovations into a global tech behemoth. He saw her pregnancy not as a miracle, but as a final binding clause in a contract he was desperate to terminate. She was 7 months along her body, changing in ways that seemed to him a physical manifestation of their growing distance. She moved through their sterile apartment with a quiet, infuriating grace, her hand often resting on her belly, as if guarding a treasure he had no claim to. Then came Cassandra Lowell. Cassandra was everything Grace was not. She was a sunburst in his monochrome world. A marketing executive from a rival firm he'd been trying to acquire, she was sharp, vivacious, and utterly enthralled by him. She didn't care about the art on the walls. She cared about the man who bought it. She listened not with polite patience, but with a wide-eyed, breathless admiration that made him feel like the titan he was. She made him forget the headaches, the creeping fatigue, the death sentence looming over him. With Cassandra, he wasn't a dying man. He was Charles Whitmore, the legend. She doesn't understand the burden of it all. Johnny Cassandra would whisper, her fingers tracing the tense line of his jaw as they sat in her cozy, cluttered apartment downtown, an antidote to his penthouse. The weight of this empire. She just enjoys the fruits of it. I see the sacrifice. I see you. He drank her sympathy like a parched man drinks water. He began to believe her narrative. Grace, with her quiet strength and self-possessed nature, became a cold, unfeeling heiress in his mind. Her composure was indifference. Her practicality was a lack of passion. Cassandra, clinging to his arm, mirroring his every opinion, was true love. The decision solidified a month ago, during a particularly grueling week of radiation therapy. The treatments left him weak, irritable, and terrified. Grace had tried to accompany him, but he'd pushed her away. "I don't need a nursemaid," he'd snapped. He'd called Cassandra instead, who arrived with a cashmere blanket and stories of corporate battles that made him feel powerful again. That night, he called his personal lawyer, a slick, ambitious man named Damien Pierce. "I need to make changes to my estate plan, Damien." Charles said, his voice raspy. "Drastic changes." Pierce, ever the sycophant, didn't question it. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Whatever you need. I'm creating a new primary beneficiary." Charles continued, the words feeling righteous and powerful on his tongue. "I want everything, the controlling shares of Whitmore Innovations, the portfolio, the properties, the art collection. Everything to go into a trust for Cassandra Lowell." There was a brief pause on the line. "And Mrs. Whitmore?" Pierce asked, a hint of caution in his voice. "Grace will be provided for," Charles said dismissively, as if speaking of a distant employee. "The prenuptial agreement dictates a settlement. She'll get that. Not a penny more. My legacy, my life's work, it goes to the person who truly values it. And me." He knew it was cruel. He knew on some level it was monstrous to do this to the mother of his child. But the cancer had burned away his sentimentality. He felt he was racing against the clock to correct a cosmic error. He had spent his life building a kingdom and married the wrong queen. This was his last great executive decision. The day of the signing was a crisp autumn afternoon. The sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Charles, dressed in a bespoke suit that now hung slightly loose on his frame, felt a surge of vitality he hadn't felt in weeks. Cassandra was by his side, a vision in a cream-colored dress. She looked solemn, her hand resting gently on his arm. She played the part of the reluctant, awed beneficiary to perfection. Damien Pierce arrived with a leather briefcase, his movements efficient and discreet. He laid the documents on the massive obsidian desk. The main document was a codicil to his last will and testament, a thick sheaf of papers that effectively disinherited his wife and unborn child from the vast bulk of his fortune. "Everything is as you requested, Mr. Whitmore," Pierce said, smoothly uncapping a heavy fountain pen. "The codicil is ironclad. Upon your passing, Miss Lowell will become the sole trustee and beneficiary of the Whitmore Trust, which will encompass all assets listed in Schedule A." Charles glanced at Cassandra. Her eyes were glistening with what he mistook for unshed tears of gratitude. She gave his hand a squeeze that said, "You're so brave. You're so right." He took the pen. The weight of it felt good in his hand. This was power. This was control. In a life that was rapidly losing, both this act felt like a final defiant victory. He looked at the signature line, his name typed neatly beneath it. Charles Gregory Whitmore. He lowered the nib to the paper, the scratch of it echoing in the silent, cavernous room. He signed with a steady hand, a final, bold stroke of ownership. He was setting things right. He was securing his legacy. He was finally, utterly free. The signature was complete. A dark, assertive slash of ink against the creamy white of the page. Charles Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair, a profound sense of relief washing over him, so potent it momentarily eclipsed the persistent thrum of pain behind his eyes. He had done it. He had wrestled his life's narrative back from the indifferent fate prescribed by his doctors and the silent judgment of his wife. Cassandra Lowell let out a soft, theatrical sigh, her perfectly manicured hand coming to rest on her chest. "Oh, Johnny," She breathed her voice a carefully calibrated mix of awe and sorrow. I don't know what to say. This is too much. Are you sure? It was a masterful performance. The slight tremor in her voice, the wide, vulnerable eyes. She knew the question was the one thing that would solidify his resolve. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Charles said, his voice firm. He reached across the desk and took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. He saw their future, or rather her future, built on his past. He pictured her at the helm of his company, a powerful, beautiful steward of his legacy forever, grateful forever his. It was a far more appealing image than Grace, a wealthy widow raising a child who would barely remember him. Damien Pierce, the lawyer, offered a tight, professional smile. He began to methodically gather the signed pages, tapping them into a neat stack. Everything appears to be in order. I've brought a notary with me. We just need her to witness and apply her seal, and the codicil will be legally executed. He gestured to a severe-looking woman who had been standing silently by the door. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. As she prepared her stamp, Cassandra leaned in and kissed Charles's cheek. Her perfume, a heady scent of gardenia and ambition, enveloped him. "You've given me a life I could only dream of," she whispered, her lips close to his ear. "But more than that, you've trusted me. I won't let you down. I'll protect everything you've built. For you." The words were a balm to his bruised ego. For months, he had felt his power, his very identity being eroded by the disease. His doctors spoke to him in condescendingly simple terms. His board of directors looked at him with pity. Grace treated him with a gentle, frustrating care he interpreted as a sign she already saw him as an invalid. But Cassandra saw him as a king, even as he was abdicating his throne. The notary applied her stamp with a solid, satisfying thud. First on the codicil, then on the documents officially restructuring the trust. Thud, thud, thud. Each sound was a nail in the coffin of his old life, his old obligations. "It's done," Pierce announced, sliding the documents into a pristine file folder. "Legally binding and irrevocable." A triumphant smile finally broke free on Cassandra's face. She squeezed Charles's hand again, harder this time. "Let's have champagne," she said, her voice suddenly lighter, brighter. To celebrate you and your incredible, generous heart." Charles nodded, feeling a giddy sense of transgression. It was almost 3 in the afternoon, but the rules no longer seemed to apply to him. He was a man living on borrowed time, and he intended to spend it as he pleased. He was about to ring for his housekeeper when the sound of the private elevator chiming in the foyer cut through the celebratory atmosphere. A moment later, the double doors to the living area swung open with a soft hydraulic hiss. And there stood Grace. She wasn't frantic or disheveled, as he might have imagined her if she'd somehow discovered his plan. There were no tears, no hysterics. That he thought with a flash of irritation would have at least given him the satisfaction of a scene. Instead, she was the picture of unnerving serenity. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue maternity dress that accentuated the full curve of her belly. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat chignon, and her face, though pale, was composed. But it wasn't just her calm demeanor that seized the attention of everyone in the room. It was the man standing beside her. He was older, in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a frame that was still imposing within his impeccably tailored charcoal suit. He carried a worn, dark leather briefcase that looked like it had held documents of immense importance for decades. His eyes, a sharp, intelligent blue, swept across the room, taking in the scene Charles at his desk. Cassandra's hand possessively on his, the lawyer with his file, the lingering scent of expensive perfume. The man's face remained impassive, but his presence instantly changed the atmospheric pressure in the room. It went from a private conspiratorial celebration to a formal public reckoning. Charles recognized him immediately, and a cold dread entirely separate from his illness began to seep into his bones. It was Gareth Pembroke. Pembroke wasn't just any lawyer. He was the lawyer. He had been Charles's father's lawyer and confidant, the architect of the original corporate structure of Whitmore Innovations. He was a legend in corporate law, a man who operated on a level of power and influence that made Damien Pierce look like a first-year associate. Charles hadn't spoken to him in years, preferring Pierce's modern, pliable approach to Pembroke's old-world, unbending ethics. Grace Charles said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "What is this? This is a private meeting." Grace's gaze met his, and for the first time he saw something other than quiet sadness in her eyes. It was a flicker of steel. "I know Charles," she said, her voice even and clear. "Our timing, it seems, is impeccable." She took a step into the room, her hand protectively on her stomach. Pembroke followed, placing his briefcase on the edge of the obsidian desk with a soft, definitive thud that seemed to mock the notary's stamp. Cassandra shifted uncomfortably, her grip on Charles's hand, faltering. "Johnny, who are these people?" she whispered, her voice laced with suspicion. "This is my wife, Grace," Charles said through gritted teeth. "And this is Gareth Pembroke, an old family acquaintance." Counsel Pembroke corrected him, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention. He looked directly at Damien Pierce, who suddenly seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. "Mr. Pierce, I believe you are representing Mr. Whitmore in this matter." Pierce flustered, straightened his tie. "Yes, I am. And as Mr. Whitmore stated, this is a confidential matter. Confidentiality does not extend to the facilitation of fraud." Mr. Pierce Pembroke said, his tone icy. Charles slammed his hand on the desk. "Fraud? What the hell are you talking about, Gareth? I am of sound mind and body, and I am making a change to my own will, to dispose of my assets as I see fit." That Mr. Pembroke said, his fingers resting on the clasps of his briefcase, is precisely the point of contention. The question of what exactly constitutes your assets. He undid the latches with 2 sharp clicks. "You see, Charles, while you've been busy signing codicils, you seem to have forgotten about the document that matters. The one document you can't change. The one that predates your will, your trust, and even your marriage." He opened the briefcase and pulled out not a single sheaf of papers, but a thick, leather-bound folio tied with a faded blue ribbon. It looked less like a legal document and more like a historical artifact. "You've just signed away what you believe to be the entirety of your fortune." Pembroke continued, his gaze unwavering. "A commendable, if foolish, romantic gesture. However, the document you just executed is for all intents and purposes largely a piece of fiction." Grace stood silently beside him, her expression unreadable. The afternoon sun caught the simple gold band on her finger, the only piece of jewelry she wore. A ring Charles hadn't truly looked at in years. A ring he was about to discover that signified a bond far stronger and more binding than the one he thought he had just broken. The air in the penthouse crackled with a new kind of tension. The triumphant glee of a few moments ago had curdled into confusion and hostility. Charles stared at the archaic-looking folio on his desk, then at Gareth Pembroke's unyielding face. "What is that?" Charles demanded, his voice rising. "Some relic from my father's ancient history. My father is dead. Gareth, I am the chairman and CEO of Whitmore Innovations. I own a 90% controlling stake. It's a matter of public record." "Public record, yes." Pembroke conceded with a slight condescending nod. "But the public record doesn't always tell the whole story. It tells you what is owned, but not always how it is owned. Or more importantly, how it came to be." He turned his piercing blue eyes to Damien Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, as Mr. Whitmore's counsel, were you ever made aware of the Whitmore Roads Foundational Trust Agreement?" Pierce blinked, his professional veneer cracking. He glanced at Charles, then back at Pembroke, looking utterly lost. The what? No. All of Mr. Whitmore's holdings are consolidated in the Whitmore Trust established in 2015. I have the charter right here. "I'm sure you do," Pembroke said, dryly. "A fine document for holding personal effects, but it is subordinate. A dinghy tied to a battleship. With a deliberate slowness, Pembroke untied the faded ribbon on the folio and opened it. The pages within were aged, the text created by a typewriter, the signatures at the bottom written in a bold cursive script from another era. "This, Pembroke announced to the room, is the instrument that created Whitmore Innovations. It was executed not by you, Charles, nor even solely by your father. It was an agreement between two parties, your father Robert Whitmore and his partner Gregory Rhodes." Charles felt a jolt, as if the floor had dropped out from under him. Gregory Rhodes, Grace's father, the quiet, brilliant professor who had passed away a decade ago. He'd always thought of him as a kindly, if ineffectual man, whom his own father had mentored. My father's partner Charles scoffed, though a seed of doubt was taking root. Rhodes was an academic. My father built that company from the ground up in his garage. It was the creation myth he'd told 100 times, the cornerstone of his own identity. "A common and useful fiction," Pembroke said, his voice cutting through Charles's bluster. "Your father was a brilliant salesman, a visionary promoter. But the core technology, the foundational patents for the data compression algorithms that launched the company, those were not his. They were the creation of Gregory Rhodes." He slid a document across the desk. It was a patent application dated nearly 40 years ago. The inventor's name was clearly listed, Gregory M. Rhodes. "Your father had the vision to monetize the technology." Pembroke explained, his tone that of a professor lecturing a slow student. Professor Rhodes had no interest in the world of business. He wanted to continue his research, so they formed a partnership memorialized in this foundational trust. Robert Whitmore would be the public face, the CEO, the builder. In exchange for his intellectual property, a 60% share of the company's equity was placed into an irrevocable trust for Gregory Rhodes and his direct descendants. Your father retained 40%, which is the sum of the shares you inherited and built upon. Charles's mind reeled. He felt dizzy, the room tilting slightly. 60%? It was impossible. "No," he stammered. "That can't be right. My father's will. It left me everything. It left you his everything." Pembroke corrected. his 40%. The shares that gave you the title of chairman and the largest single voting block. But it did not and could not give you what was never his to give. The road's 60% stake was held in the foundational trust, managed by a trustee, myself in fact, until Gregory's heir came of age and married, at which point the controlling interest would pass to her. Every head in the room slowly turned towards Grace. She stood poised and still, her silence more powerful than any outburst. She looked directly at Charles, and the quiet sadness he had so long resented was gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable strength. The trust's terms were specific, Grace said, speaking for the first time since she entered. Her voice did not waver. My father knew his own nature. He knew he wasn't a businessman. He trusted your father to build the company, but he wanted to ensure his family's future was protected. The controlling interest passed to me upon our marriage, Charles. Charles stared at her, his mouth agape. The pieces of his life were rearranging themselves into a picture he didn't recognize. Her quietness hadn't been passivity. It had been the confidence of a majority shareholder. Her lack of interference in the business wasn't disinterest. It was trust, a trust he had just proven he was unworthy of. Cassandra, who had been watching this exchange with growing horror, finally found her voice. This is insane. You're telling me she's owned the company all this time precisely, Pembroke affirmed. Mrs. Whitmore has been the silent majority partner for the entirety of your marriage. Out of respect for Charles's role and ego, she agreed to let him continue to run the company as he saw fit, with her voting shares held in proxy by him. A proxy, I might add, that was revocable at any time. Pembroke produced another more modern-looking document from his briefcase, which she did this morning. This is a formal revocation of proxy. As of 9:00 a.m. today, Charles no longer holds the voting rights for the Rhodes shares. The blood drained from Charles's face. He felt a sudden, crushing weakness in his limbs. So what exactly did you just sign away? Charles Pembroke asked, his voice laced with surgical precision. You signed a codicil giving Ms. Lowell here your personal assets, your 40% stake in Whitmore Innovations, this penthouse which is titled in your name, your art collection, your stock portfolio. A considerable fortune, to be sure. A billionaire, several times over, in fact. He paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air before delivering the final devastating blow. But you did not sign away the company. You signed away your minority stake in it. You have just given your mistress a very, very generous gift. But you have also given your wife undisputed, absolute control of the board, the company, and its future. Cassandra let go of Charles's hand, as if it were red hot. Her face a moment ago, a mask of loving concern, was now a canvas of pure, unadulterated fury. She wasn't looking at Grace or Pembroke. She was staring at Charles with utter contempt. You absolute fool, she hissed, the whisper more venomous than a shout. You told me you owned it all. You let me believe. You let me. Charles couldn't speak. The empire he thought he was bequeathing was never his to give. The grand final act of his life wasn't a tragedy. It was a farce. He was a king who had just discovered his crown was made of cardboard. And the quiet, unassuming woman standing before him, the woman he had tried to cast aside, was, and always had, been the true ruler of his kingdom. The silence that followed Pembroke's revelation was heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the distant, indifferent hum of city traffic 80 floors below. Charles Whitmore sat frozen at his desk, the architect of a grand deception, only to discover he was its sole victim. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and strategic calculation, was a ruin. He replayed the last 10 years of his life. Every decision, every argument, every moment of condescension towards Grace now cast in a humiliating new light. Her trips to see her family lawyers in Boston weren't quaint visits. They were shareholder meetings with her trustee. Her quiet reading of the company's quarterly reports wasn't a wife's dutiful interest. It was an owner's oversight. Her gentle suggestions about a new R&D direction or a problematic executive which he'd often dismissed were the soft-pedaled directives of the person who held the ultimate power. He had been the acting manager, strutting and preening on a stage she owned. Cassandra was the first to break. Her shock morphed into a raw, feral rage. The mask of the devoted soulmate didn't just slip, it was torn away. 40% she spat her voice a low, vicious snarl. She rounded on Charles, her eyes blazing. "You have been sitting here for months, playing the tragic emperor, telling me you were leaving me your legacy and all you had was a minority stake. Did you lie to me or are you just that stupid?" Charles flinched as if struck. The adoration he had basked in was gone, replaced by a contempt so profound it was almost physical. I didn't know," he stammered the words, tasting like ash. "My father. He never told me the specifics." "Oh, that makes it so much better." Cassandra's laugh was a sharp, ugly sound. "You built your entire life on a lie and didn't even bother to check the paperwork, and you dragged me into it." She paced in front of the desk, her movements agitated like a caged animal. "This changes everything. A minority stake is useless without board cooperation. She controls the board. She can dilute the shares issue, new stock. My 40% could be worthless in a year." Her swift, brutal analysis of the financial situation was chilling. There was no grief for his betrayal of their supposed love, only fury at the miscalculation of her investment. She wasn't his lover who had been deceived. She was his co-conspirator in a coup that had spectacularly failed. Damian Pierce, seeing his own future as legal counsel to a powerless minority shareholder evaporate, began to backpedal furiously. "Mr. Pembroke, I assure you I was acting on the information provided by my client. I had no knowledge of this foundational agreement. The due diligence was based on public filings." Pembroke cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Your incompetence is a matter for the Bar Association, Mr. Pierce, not for me. You may see yourself out." Pierce, pale and sweating, didn't need to be told twice. He snatched his briefcase and practically fled the room, leaving the notary to scurry out behind him. He left the file containing the newly signed codicil on the desk, an irrelevant postscript to a story he had completely misunderstood. Now it was just the four of them. The ruined king, the furious pretender, the rightful queen, and her loyal knight. Charles finally looked at Grace, truly looked at her. He was searching for triumph in her eyes, for a gloating smirk, for anything to justify his narrative of her as a cold, calculating woman. He found none. He saw only a deep, weary sorrow. "Why, Grace?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why let me believe it all this time? Why the charade?" Grace took a slow step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "It wasn't a charade, Charles. It was a marriage. It was how my father wanted it. He knew your father's pride. He knew your pride. He believed the company would thrive with a Whitmore at the helm, driven and hungry. He set up the trust to protect me, not to rule you. He wanted me to have a partner, not an employee. Her voice was steady, but laced with a pain that was a decade deep. I loved the man I married, the brilliant, ambitious man who was going to change the world. I didn't want to be the woman who held the purse strings. I wanted to be your wife. I trusted you. I believed that our partnership was built on more than just shares and voting rights. I thought it was built on love and respect. She gestured vaguely towards Cassandra, who stood scowling by the window. I saw what was happening. I'm not blind. I saw the late nights, the sudden business trips. I saw how she looked at you, how you looked at her. I thought it was a symptom of your fear of the diagnosis. I was willing to fight for you, for us, for our family. I was willing to weather this storm, thinking you were just lost. She paused, her hand coming to rest on her belly. But then I found out about the lawyer, about the plan to change the will. That's when I realized you weren't lost, Charles. You were cruel. You weren't just leaving me. You were trying to erase me. You were trying to take my child's future, my father's legacy, everything that anchored me, and hand it to her on a silver platter. You weren't just ending a marriage. You were trying to burn down my entire life. Each word was a quiet indictment, a precise incision into the heart of his self-delusion. This she said, her voice gaining a cold, hard edge as she gestured around the opulent room. Was never about power for me, until you tried to use it against me. You forced my hand. You turned our marriage into a business transaction, so I have been forced to respond as a businesswoman. Gareth Pembroke stepped forward and placed the foundational agreement back in his briefcase, the click of the latches echoing the finality of her words. A special board meeting for Whitmore Innovations has been called for. Tomorrow morning, Pembroke stated formally. The agenda will include the immediate removal of Charles Whitmore as chairman and CEO on grounds of gross dereliction of fiduciary duty. A new slate of board members, loyal to the majority shareholder, will be presented, and a motion will be introduced to initiate a formal investigation into any potential misappropriation of corporate funds over the last calendar year. The last sentence was aimed squarely at Cassandra. Any company credit cards, any trips booked through corporate accounts, any lavish gifts would now be under a microscope. Cassandra's face went white. The financial implications hit her like a tidal wave. She had won a Pyrrhic victory. She was now the owner of a vast but non-controlling block of shares in a company run by the woman she had tried to supplant, a woman who now had every reason to make her life and her investment a living hell. She turned on Charles one last time, her voice dripping with pure acid. "Congratulations, Johnny. You've ruined us both. I hope you enjoy your final months in your beautiful penthouse. You'll have plenty of time for reflection." Without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the room. The slam of the penthouse door, the final undignified punctuation mark on their grand romance. Charles was left alone, surrounded by the trappings of a kingdom he no longer ruled, facing the wife he had so profoundly underestimated. The physical pain from his tumor was nothing compared to the agony of his humiliation. He had tried to write the final chapter of his life as a love story. Instead, he had authored his own pathetic downfall. The rage had passed, leaving behind the hollow ache of absolute defeat. Charles sat slumped in his chair, the signed codicil still lying on his desk like a monument to his own stupidity. Cassandra's parting words echoed in the vast, silent room. The empire was gone. The great love was a fraud. All that remained was the truth embodied by the calm, resolute woman and the silver-haired lawyer who were now dismantling his life with quiet precision. He looked up at Grace, his eyes pleading for something understanding, pity he didn't know what. "Your father, Gregory." He never said a word. All those years at family dinners, holidays. He just sat there smiling, talking about his students and his research. He let my father take all the credit. Grace walked over to the immense window that overlooked Central Park. The autumn leaves were a riot of gold and crimson, a beautiful dying spectacle. "He didn't care about credit," she said softly, her back to him. "He cared about creation." My father was the purest mind I've ever known. He saw the world in elegant equations and beautiful structures. Business to him was a noisy, vulgar distraction. He saw the fire in your father, the same fire he saw in you. The drive to build, to conquer. He admired it. He just didn't want it for himself. Gareth Pembroke. Seeing that the legal portion of the day was over and the personal reckoning had begun, gave a slight bow of his head. "Grace, I will be downstairs if you need me. I have some calls to make to prepare for tomorrow's meeting." He gave Charles one last unpitying look before departing, leaving husband and wife alone for the first time since the world had been remade. When the door closed, Grace turned around. "Do you remember the first time you came to my parents' house for dinner?" Charles blinked, the memory foggy. It felt like a lifetime ago. Barely. "I remember being nervous, trying to impress your father." "You did," she said. "You talked for 2 hours straight about your vision for the company, expanding into Asia, developing mobile applications. This was years before anyone was even thinking about it. You were so alive, so full of energy. My father just listened, nodding. Afterwards, when you'd left, he turned to me and said, 'That young man has a hunger. Robert found the right engine for my train.' An engine for his train. The metaphor was so perfect, so utterly diminishing, that it made Charles's stomach clench. He had always seen himself as the sole inventor, the driver the entire railroad. He gave you his greatest gift. Charles. Grace continued, her voice filled with a reverence that shamed him. It wasn't the technology. It was his trust. He entrusted you through my father-in-law, and then through me with his life's work. The agreement wasn't some cunning trap. It was an act of faith. It was structured to let a Whitmore run the company while a Rhodes held it safe. A partnership. One your father honored his entire life, and one you tried to desecrate. He finally understood the depth of his betrayal. It wasn't just against Grace. It was against the ghost of a quiet, brilliant man who had made his entire life possible. The Whitmore creation myth, the story he'd told himself and the world, was a lie. He wasn't a self-made man. He was an inheritor, a steward who had tried to steal the temple. I was sick. He said, the excuse sounding feeble even to his own ears. The diagnosis. It twisted everything in my head. I felt like I was running out of time. I wanted. He trailed off, unsure of what he had truly wanted. You wanted a different life, Grace finished for him, her perception unnervingly accurate. You looked at me at our baby, and you saw the end of your story. She offered you a fantasy, an escape. I understand that, Charles. I do. But your fear, your selfishness, it doesn't give you the right to destroy the lives of others. It doesn't give you the right to try and disinherit your own child. Her hand went to her belly again, the gesture both protective and accusatory. The child, the innocent life caught in the wreckage of his decisions, the heir to the Rhodes legacy and the Whitmore name, the true future of the company. The assets you signed over to Cassandra Grace, said her tone shifting, becoming more practical, colder. The 40% stake this apartment your personal wealth. It's a vast sum. She will be a very wealthy woman, but she will also be a permanent thorn in the company's side. An outside party with a significant and likely hostile minority stake. Cleaning up that mess will be my first official act as chairwoman. He could already see it playing out. The legal battles, the proxy fights, the corporate warfare. Grace allied with Pembroke would be a formidable opponent. Cassandra, driven by spite and greed, would be relentless. He had not created a clean break. He had set the stage for a long, ugly war, funded by his own money. "I want you to leave, Charles," Grace said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "This apartment belongs to Cassandra now, legally. Or it will as soon as the estate transfers. Until then, it is still our home. My home. And I will not spend another night here with you." The finality of it hit him harder than anything else. He was being evicted from his own life. "Where will I go?" he asked, the question pathetic and childish. "I'm sure Cassandra has a lovely apartment downtown." Grace replied, her voice tinged with ice. "Perhaps she'll let you stay there. You just made her a billionaire after all. It's the least she can do." She walked towards the bedroom, pausing at the doorway. "You should know," she said, turning back to look at him one last time. "The doctors at Memorial Sloan Kettering have a new experimental trial for glioblastoma. It's showing some promise. I had my assistant schedule a consultation for you. It's for next Tuesday." He stared at her, stunned into silence. After everything he had done, after the betrayal and the cruelty, she had still been trying to save his life. "I was doing it for our child," she clarified, as if reading his mind. "He deserves to know his father, or at least to have the chance to. But now, I think it's better if he only knows the story of his grandfather, Gregory Rhodes, a man of integrity." She disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. The click of the latch was the sound of a book closing a chapter, ending a life being locked away. Charles Whitmore sat alone in the cavernous living room of the penthouse. He no longer owned a minority shareholder in a company he used to command a husband to a woman who was now his adversary. He was a dying man who had spent his last reserves of strength not fighting for his life, but orchestrating his own irrelevance. He had sought to control his legacy and, in one afternoon, had lost it completely. The days that followed were a blur of sterile hotel rooms and strained phone calls. Charles, stripped of his home and his power, found himself adrift in the city he once commanded. His first call, naturally, was to Cassandra. It went as poorly as he could have imagined. "What do you want, Charles?" she answered, her voice cold and clipped. There was no Johnny, no term of endearment. "Cassandra, we need to talk. We need a strategy," he said, trying to inject a sense of command into his voice. "With my knowledge of the company and your shares, we can form a powerful bloc." Her laughter was sharp and humorless. "We? There is no we. There is you, the fool who didn't know he was a glorified employee for a decade, and there is me, the woman holding a 40% stake in a company that is now actively hostile to my interests. You are no longer of any use to me. But I gave you everything." He protested, the words weak and pathetic. "You gave me a headache," she retorted. "You gave me a protracted legal battle against a woman who has the board the history and the moral high ground on her side. Your everything and is a golden parachute into a war zone. I'm meeting with my new lawyers this afternoon. Do not call me again. They will be in touch with you if they need a statement about your incompetence. The line went dead. The great love of his life had revealed herself to be nothing more than a ruthless opportunist who had made a bad investment. The comfort and adoration she had provided were simply tools of her trade, now discarded as useless. He was alone. The news of the corporate upheaval at Whitmore Innovations broke the next day. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story. Whitmore ousted in shock, shake-up. Wife Grace Rhodes. Whitmore assumes control. The article detailed the previously unknown history of the company's founding, painting a picture of Gregory Rhodes as the quiet genius and Grace as the powerful, silent heir. Charles was portrayed as a figurehead, a long-serving CEO, who had been unceremoniously removed by the true power behind the throne. His legacy was being rewritten in public, and he was the villain of the story. His health, which had felt momentarily robust in the heat of his defiant act, began to decline rapidly. The stress accelerated the cancer's relentless march. Headaches that were once manageable became blinding. His formidable memory began to fray at the edges. He forgot names, appointments. He would wake up in his impersonal hotel suite and for a terrifying moment not know where he was. He missed the consultation for the experimental trial Grace had booked for him. He simply forgot about it until 2 days later. When he called to reschedule, he was told the next available appointment was in 6 weeks. In his world, 6 weeks was an eternity. A week after the signing, a courier delivered a box to his hotel. It contained his remaining personal effects from the penthouse, a few suits, some books, his watch collection. There was no note from Grace. It was a clear, final act of severance. Tucked inside one of the suit pockets, he found a small, framed photo he hadn't seen in years. It was from early in their marriage, taken on a trip to the Italian coast. He and Grace were sitting at an outdoor cafe, squinting in the bright sun, both of them laughing. Her head was thrown back in genuine, uninhibited joy. He looked happy. Truly, deeply happy. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt that way. He stared at the photo until his vision blurred. The legal fallout was swift and brutal. Cassandra, true to her word, launched a series of aggressive, frivolous lawsuits against the new board of Whitmore Innovations, alleging shareholder oppression and mismanagement. It was a transparent attempt to bleed the company and force a buyout of her shares at an inflated price. Grace, with Gareth Pembroke at her side, didn't just defend, she counterattacked. They opened the investigation into Charles's last year as CEO, and the results were damning. They found a clear pattern of misappropriated funds, lavish non-business trips with Cassandra exorbitant gifts listed as corporate expenses, a consulting contract awarded to a shell company owned by one of Cassandra's friends. Faced with the threat of a civil suit for fraud and potential criminal charges, Cassandra's legal team quickly changed their tune. The bluster and aggression vanished, replaced by a desperate desire to negotiate. Charles watched all of this from the sidelines, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. He had occasional stilted conversations with Damien Pierce, his former lawyer, who was now facing his own professional sanctions for his role in the codicil signing. Pierce spoke of the negotiations between Grace's and Cassandra's legal teams. They're hammering out a settlement, Pierce told him over the phone, his voice tinged with a bitter, resentful respect. Your wife, she's a killer. She's not just trying to win, she's trying to annihilate. She offered to buy back Cassandra's shares, but at a 20% discount from their current market value, citing the potential reputational damage from the fraud investigation. And she's demanding a personal clawback of $2 million from Cassandra for the misappropriated funds. Will she take it? Charles asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. She has no choice, Pierce said. Grace has her backed into a corner. Take a small loss and walk away. A multi-billionaire, or risk losing a huge chunk of it and facing public humiliation and legal charges. She'll take the deal. And she did. A month after she had stormed out of the penthouse, Cassandra Lowell signed the settlement. She walked away with an obscene amount of money. But she was vanquished. She was forced to sell back the shares, severing her connection to the company forever. She was a footnote in the history of Whitmore Innovations, a cautionary tale. Charles's 40% stake was back under the control of the company, consolidated under Grace's leadership. The wound he had tried to inflict on his family's legacy had been surgically excised. The company was whole again, stronger and more secure than ever under its rightful owner. His own finances were a wreck. The legal fees from his divorce, which Grace had quietly filed, and the fallout from the corporate investigation had taken a huge toll. The great wealth he had commanded was gone. He had enough to live comfortably in his hotel, to pay for his mounting medical bills, but the sheer scale of his former life had vanished. The penthouse he had signed away with such bravado was now officially back in Grace's name, part of the corporate assets she controlled. He was a king in exile, stripped of his kingdom, his wealth, his queen, and his health. All he had left were his regrets, a bitter harvest from the seeds of betrayal he had sown. The first snow of winter was falling thick, silent flakes, dusting the windows of the hospice room. Charles Whitmore watched them, his world now confined to a bed, a window, and the steady rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. The glioblastoma had been merciless. It had taken his strength, his coordination, and now it was stealing his words, leaving his thoughts trapped in a fog of confusion. He had been here for a month. No visitors came. Cassandra had vanished, rumored to be living in Monaco, erasing her past with champagne and sunshine. Damian Pierce was fighting to keep his law license. The world Charles had built, the people who had populated his orbit of power, had moved on without him. There were moments of clarity, sharp, painful islands in the sea of his cognitive decline. In these moments he thought of Grace. He thought of the photograph from Italy. He thought of her quiet strength, the strength he had mistaken for weakness. He finally understood that she had not been fighting him for control of the company. She had been protecting it from his ego, his fear, and his catastrophic final mistake. One afternoon, a nurse came in with a small package. "This was delivered for you, Mr. Whitmore." His hands trembled as he fumbled with the wrapping. Inside was a simple, elegant photo album. He opened it to the first page. It was a photograph of a baby, wrapped in a soft white blanket, sleeping peacefully. The baby had a shock of dark hair, just like his. Beneath the photo, a caption was written in Grace's neat, clear script. Gregory Rhodes Whitmore. Born November 12th. Healthy and strong. He turned the pages. There were dozens of photos of the baby sleeping, yawning, his tiny hand wrapped around a woman's finger. Charles's finger, he realized with a pang. In one photo, the baby was being held up to look at a large framed portrait on a wall. It was the portrait of Professor Gregory Rhodes that used to hang in their library. The last page of the album held a single folded sheet of paper. It was a letter. "Charles, I am sending you these so you can see your son. He is beautiful. He has your eyes, but I hope he has his grandfather's heart. a heart full of curiosity and integrity, not ambition and fear. The company is stable. I have established the Gregory Rhodes Foundation for Ethical Innovation, funded by the shares you signed over to Ms. Lowell. His legacy will now be to support young, brilliant minds who value discovery over profit. Your last act, however unintentional, will be one of philanthropy. I have forgiven you, not for your sake, but for mine, and for our son's. I cannot raise him in a house poisoned by bitterness. He will know who his father was, the brilliant man who built an empire. I will choose to remember that version of you, the man in the photograph from Italy. I hope you find peace. Charles. Grace. Tears hot and slow tracked down his gaunt cheeks. An act of philanthropy. She had taken his ugliest, most selfish act and transformed it into something good. She had not erased him from the story, as he had tried to do to her. She had simply edited his ending, granting him a sliver of grace he in no way deserved. He clutched the album to his chest. The beeping of the monitor seemed to slow, to soften. He looked out the window at the snow, at the world being covered in a blanket of clean, quiet white. He had spent his life chasing a loud legacy, one of shouting headlines and soaring stock prices. He had wanted his name carved onto buildings, but he had failed to see the value in a quiet legacy, in a partnership, in a family, in the integrity of a good man's name. Grace and her son Gregory Rhodes Whitmore would carry that quiet legacy forward. The Whitmore name would survive, but it would be the Rhodes spirit that defined it. The engine had finally fallen silent, but the train, under the steady hand of its rightful owner, would continue on its journey, carrying the future he had so foolishly tried to leave behind. His last clear thought was not of power or wealth, but of a baby's eyes and a forgiveness he had never earned. In the end, Charles Whitmore's signature wasn't an act of power, but his final foolish confession. He tried to rewrite his legacy in the name of a fleeting affair, only to discover the story had been authored long before he ever held the pen. He learned the hardest lesson of all, that the assets we consign away are never as valuable as the trusts we betray. Grace, a mother, and now the guardian of a true dynasty, proved that real power isn't seized in a moment of passion. It's built quietly with integrity and defended with unshakable resolve. Her victory wasn't just in a boardroom, but in the quiet strength of protecting her child's future from the ghosts of his father's past, transforming an act of malice into a legacy of hope. What did you think of Grace's ultimate power move? Was her final act of sending the photos an act of grace or the ultimate victory lap? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of justice and resilience, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a good tale of triumph, and be sure to subscribe for more stories where the truth always finds its way into the light.